What would you do if, after years of building a life, you found an anniversary card that proved your wife had another man? Not just a lover, but your own business partner. Betrayal doesn't just break hearts. It destroys families, finances, and everything you thought you controlled. This is not just a story about cheating. It's about deception, financial abuse, shattered trust, and the fight to reclaim dignity. Stay with me, because what I uncovered forced me to choose between revenge, survival, and the legacy I'd leave behind. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from, city/country. And drop your take in the comments as you watch. Share your reaction, opinions, and what you think really happened. I read them all. We'll be giving shoutouts to standout comments and videos in the next upload, so make sure yours counts. My name is Parker Winston. I was born the son of a farmer in Georgia, the kind of place where a handshake meant business and a man's word was his honor. By 24, I had traded the plow for a steering wheel, learning to drive big rigs from my uncle and tasting a kind of independence I had only read about. When Maya walked into my life in 1965, she carried a city smile and the confidence of a sales rep. We married fast, the kind of whirlwind that felt like destiny, and I believed then, and for a long time after, that trust would carry us through anything. We started modestly in an Atlanta suburb, a small porch, a radio that rarely found a clear station, and the smell of coffee every morning. By 1980, our house was full. Frank, Aurora, and Donald filled rooms with noise and stubborn joy. I drove highways, loading freight. Maya met clients and closed deals. Neighbors saw a family with simple values: independence, resourcefulness, and a dignity that earned nods at church. I wore those labels with pride. Provider, husband, father. There were peculiarities: trips to Alabama, a check mailed monthly to a sick brother named Thompson. I never pressed. In my time, a husband did not pry. One provided and protected. I remember telling a friend, trust is the foundation. If you start tearing at it, everything else collapses. Those words were honest then, naive later. What I did not understand was the quiet work of deceit. How a life can be split into pieces that look whole from the outside. Maya was attentive. She packed lunches, kept church calendars, saved for emergencies. But she was also skilled at folding a story, tucking it into a purse or behind a ledger. She would kiss my forehead and say, "Be safe on the road," and I believed every syllable. The vocabulary of our marriage became sacred. Duty, protection, trust. Yet nights came when I cataloged bills and wondered why savings thinned when she mentioned family needs. Afternoons arrived with whispers, an extra car parked late, a caller apologizing for waking Maya when I answered. I let discomfort sit because I thought work could fix it. I believed steadfastness, keeping my head down and hands busy, was the measure of a good husband. People called me simple. Maybe I was. I had an old-fashioned faith in labels that protected me from asking hard questions. It gave me structure to raise the children and the courage to face social judgment. A man shows strength by how he faces trouble, I told Frank when he scraped his knee learning to ride. I did not yet see that strength could be hollowed by the very thing I trusted most. On the surface, life looked like success earned by perseverance. I taught my children the value of work. Frank tinkered with engines and dreamed of engineering. Aurora leaned into persuasion and business. Donald loved gadgets and made new tech his play. They were the best parts of me. Resilient, curious, stubborn in the right ways. Those children were why I believed I could hold everything together when trouble arrived. If there is a lesson in those early years, it is this: complacency can wear the same face as stability. When you mistake quiet for contentment, the foundation may already be cracking. My story begins not with betrayal but with trust, a trust so deep that it allowed betrayal to grow unnoticed. I chose then not to pry, but to live with the hope that love would explain the gaps. That choice would cost me, yet it set the stage for the kind of transformation I never imagined. I would later learn that life's deepest betrayals can be an honest teacher. Faced with the ruin of trust, some men break entirely. Others rebuild from more solid ground. That choice, to be crushed or to be remade, is the heart of what followed. I did not know then that courage was not a loud thing. It was a daily decision to feed my children, to refuse shame, to turn pain into purpose. That decision would shape a family none of us expected. So I kept driving, mending what was broken at home or on the road, and hoping small holes would never become a wound. Fate, however, is not gentle. One ordinary object, misplaced and banal, would later force me to decide whether duty to my family meant sheltering illusions or chasing the raw truth. The moment I found that object is where the quiet of my life met its first real storm. They used to say our house smelled like coffee and engine oil, which I took as a compliment. Aurora's laughter rang like a bell as she chased Frank through the yard, while Donald brought me greasy wrenches to show off brittle inventions. Those sounds made long nights on the road worthwhile. I kept a ledger in the glove compartment and receipts in a tin box under the bed. Bookkeeping was my quiet ritual. When Maya came home, she'd smooth her skirt and tell me about a closed sale over dinner. Her charm was as much a part of our life as the radio we listened to. She was good with people. Clients liked her. Her job as a sales rep suited her porchway ease. Her income mattered. We managed medical bills, car repairs, and school fees. Still, money was a balancing act. The truck's brakes did not wait for convenience, and winter demanded repairs we could scarcely afford. The pressure taught me resourcefulness. Mend what you can, borrow the rest, find another route, and I like to think that perseverance would carry us through. Neighbors watched our dignity like a lantern. Mr. Hayes nodded when I fixed his wheel. Miss Lillian brought casseroles after long hauls. Those acts of solidarity kept us afloat and gave me pride. I wanted to protect that for my family, even if protecting meant swallowing discomfort and preserving appearances. Maya's trips to Alabama were explained as visits to her brother Thompson, who she said had been injured years earlier. He's sick, she told me, and I believed her. In my time, a husband did not pry. Duty meant providing and protecting. But duty sat heavy on some nights. One evening, Aurora spotted Maya packing an extra suitcase, the kind meant for a week, not a day's visit, and the sight lodged like a burr. I recall Frank and I elbow deep in an old Ford, his jokes about designing engines in the city. I promised I would help him get there. When I came in that night, the house felt shifted. Maya seemed polite but distracted. She kissed the children and me, yet the way she closed her purse, almost ritualistic, stayed in my mind. There were practical signs. Our savings account showed smaller numbers than expected. Maya explained it away. Medical bills for Thompson. Family comes first, she said, and I agreed because family felt inviolable. Trust was the currency I spent freely. When PTA meetings came up and neighbors asked where Maya was, sales trip was my answer. Stability required silence, I thought. Still, quiet grew like mildew in the corners. Small, slow, almost invisible until the smell forced your hand to act. Once, a woman called and apologized when I answered for Maya, asking about helping Thompson get care. My throat tightened, but I let it pass. I told myself not to become the man who stalked his wife's steps. Dignity demanded discretion. Protection meant sheltering my children from scandal. By the time the children reached their teens, pressures had not eased. Frank tuned engines with a skill that made my chest swell. Aurora absorbed deals at her mother's knee. Donald devoured any new gadget. They gave me reasons to be better. I took extra shifts and odd repairs, learning to barter for tires. Perseverance became daily labor. I remember a winter evening when the children and I sat around the table, splitting a small pie as the stove acted up. Aurora said she wanted to study business. Frank asked if he could take extra shop classes. Donald wanted a radio kit. I promised I would find a way. Those promises became commitments carved from perseverance and duty. They anchored me. As doubt gathered, my resolve to secure their future hardened into a promise I would not let fail them, not ever. There are moments that feel ordinary until they stand out like mile markers on a road you only later recognize as the highway to a crisis. A returned envelope, a hurriedly hidden checkbook, the way Maya brushed hair from her face when she thought no one watched. Small signs tucked beneath daily life. I cataloged them as questions, not accusations, waiting for a pattern. The truth, of course, is patient. It does not hurry, but it does not sleep. Sometimes my greatest failing was comfort in our rhythms. My greatest virtue was the love I had for my children and the lengths I would go to keep them safe. Whether that meant trusting my wife or confronting a lie would test both my naivety and my courage. When the first unmistakable evidence arrived, I would learn how much my choices mattered. Not just for me, but for the family I had vowed to protect. The Alabama trips settled into our lives like a metronome, recurring, steady, and eventually taken for granted. Maya called them visits, and explained the money she sent each month as aid for her brother Thompson. She would kiss me at the door with a hurried, "I'll be back next week," and leave a clipboard by the kitchen table. At first the rhythm felt ordinary. She on the road closing deals, I on the highway hauling freight. We both held pieces of the life we built, or so I believed. Comfort is easy to mistake for contentment, and I learned that lesson too late. I was raised to value duty and discretion. A man provided and did not pry. That code made it easier to accept explanations. Each month Maya wrote checks, stamped envelopes, and slipped them into the mail. Sometimes I watched the steady motion of the ritual and felt gratitude. Sometimes I felt a small itch of unease. Money became both a tool and a language in our house. Payments to Thompson were explanations I accepted because the word family felt inviolable. The months piled up and Thompson's name became constant in our conversations. Maya told stories of hospital visits and insurance woes. She described the people in his small town with a familiarity that reassured me. I tightened belts, took extra shifts, fixed fences, and learned to barter for tires. Perseverance was practical work. It was not glamorous, but it kept the children fed and clothed. Still, cracks appeared. Once I drove past an Alabama diner mentioned on a route and wondered if Maya had been there. Later I found motel receipts dated for nights when she had claimed to be home. Little things stacked like coins in a jar until the pile made sense. A colleague at Maya's company mentioned irregular account transfers. The woman at her office told me she was on leave. Those remarks were gentle blows that made me look. I began to watch for patterns. I kept a small file. Phone messages, receipts, names mentioned casually. My ledger in the glove compartment shifted from numbers to evidence. I asked drivers about towns they passed through and listened for the names Maya used. Investigation, for me, was persistence. Knocking on doors of memory and following the scent of invoices. I involved the children as necessary without alarming them. Frank helped with extra jobs. Aurora looked after Donald after school when I took longer runs. My choices balanced the practicalities of work with a quiet need to understand. I did not want to make my children subjects of the search. They were anchors in a life that had become uncertain. There were times I almost confronted her, when anger rose sharp and raw. I imagined scenes of thunderous words and shattering plates. But I also imagined the children's faces and chose silence over spectacle. Dignity, I believed, meant protecting them from scandal even at the cost of my own peace. Protection had become an instinct overshadowing the desire for answers. Yet avoidance breeds its own consequences. Naivety, which had once felt like innocence, now looked like a vulnerability that fed secrecy. The more I watched, the more the pattern tightened. I could delay decision but not indefinitely. The ledger of anomalies began to feel like a map leading somewhere I was not sure I wanted to go. Then came the ordinary thing that forced my hand. An envelope misplaced in a drawer, a small paper that did not belong. It was an anniversary card addressed to Maya and signed in a way that did not fit the life I knew. Ordinary paper, ordinary ink. Yet the words on that card carried the weight of a world shifted. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the card twice because the first read felt like waking from a bad dream. The second read made my hands go cold. I thought of my father's calloused hands and the promises I owed the children. Courage, I learned, meant acting in spite of fear. That night I packed lightly, not knowing whether I would confront Maya or simply follow the trail she had unknowingly left behind on the road. I found it tucked in Maya's leather purse, an ordinary envelope with handwriting that did not belong in our house. Inside, the card addressed her as wife and mother, signed Thompson and Sarah. I read those words as if they were a foreign language. The paper was thin, but the implication was thick enough to break the rhythm of my breathing. Shock arrived like numbness. I called Maya's workplace and learned she was officially on leave. A canceled checkbook in a hidden box revealed an Indianapolis address. A utility bill matched the name. These were small papers that behaved like proof. I waited for Maya to come home, clutching the card because it felt like evidence of a life I had not known I shared. She walked in with a practiced smile, hair pinned, the way she always returned from trips. When she saw the card, her face flickered. "You weren't supposed to be here," she said quietly. That sentence contained the weight of countless lies. I asked her plainly what was happening. Her answer was not a confession but a rationalization. "I love you both." Those 3 words felt like a legal argument rather than an apology. Love, she offered, excused deception. I realized then how words could be used to cover the theft of honesty. I left the house for a long drive, sitting in the truck because motion steadied me when the world tilted. The checkbook's Indianapolis marks made the destination obvious. On the phone, I spoke politely with someone at Thompson's Freight. The voice was unaware of scandal. To them, the household arrangements were ordinary. It felt like walking into the wrong room and finding everyone comfortable. I felt like an intruder in a life that had been arranged carefully to hide its seams. When I pulled up at Thompson's Freight, the building was modest. Corrugated siding, trucks in the yard. Sarah was a girl with Maya's eyes. Seeing her made the hurt raw. Thompson greeted me with a man's gruff courtesy, unaware at first, and then with that slow dawning confusion that would change him. Maya arrived afterward, not in tears but with a steadiness that looked practiced. Confrontation followed. Questions that landed like blows, confessions that half-explained, and the small human fact of a child standing between truths neither of us could deny. The confrontation felt like an ordinary domestic quarrel turned courtroom. Maya's voice slid into negotiation, practical and steady, as if we were discussing schedules instead of shattered trust. Thompson listened with growing disbelief. His hands folded, his jaw tightening. Sarah, a child shielded from adult messiness, watched us with blank curiosity. Each sentence we traded rearranged someone's life. Maya tried to make sense of it by telling stories of need. Hospital corridors, insurance fights, a man who had nowhere else to go. She spoke as if caretaking excused omission. Her explanation framed the double life as service. To me it read as deliberate concealment. A large truth cannot live in fragments without hurting those around it. Thompson's reaction was raw. He stood abruptly and banged his palm on a bench, voice breaking. "If I had known," and could not finish. For Sarah, the revelation was a tear in fabric she had never seen was stitched. For me, it was the decision point. Shame pressed at my ribs, but duty was heavier. I had to protect my children and pursue clarity, not revenge. I left Indianapolis with the card folded into my jacket and the image of Maya's face as she stood between 2 lives. The road home felt like a corridor between past certainty and future uncertainty. I had proof, faces, and resolve that would demand both sacrifice and courage. I would not let this define us. The drive home felt long and small simultaneously. I thought of the children asleep under covers, of Aurora's wide eyes, Frank's hands stained with oil, Donald's small inventions. I promised myself then to make choices that honored them, to be honest with them when the time came, to shield them from shame without sheltering them from truth. I would not let gossip define our family. I would gather the few allies I had, lean on Mr. Jefferson and Louise, and prepare to rebuild from what remained. Steadfastly. Leaving Indianapolis, I was not the same man who had driven up that morning. Deceit had a weight that would not be shrugged off. My decision then was a difficult duty. Protect my children, pursue the truth, and refuse to let shame shape our narrative. I drove back to Atlanta with the evidence folded in my jacket and a resolve that had danger and clarity intertwined. The life I had known was fractured, but the fracture would not define everything. What came next would not be simple. She quit her job without a word and disappeared from the house and town. One day she was a wife and mother. The next she was a note in a drawer and a handful of consequences. The children woke to an emptiness I could not fill with explanations. I told them she had to take a job far away. It was a lie, but it was shelter. Protection, I believed, sometimes requires fabrication. Word spread in town like a rumor with appetite. Neighbors speculated. Abandonment, recklessness, scandal. Being a single father in the early 80s was unusual. Men did not often carry parenthood alone. There was stigma attached, a sideways pity that made me angry and determined. I refused to let our story be defined by whispers. Money was tight. Maya had contributed to household costs. Now the gap showed. I turned to what I knew: the truck, the toolbox, the stubbornness inherited from a farmer's son. I took repair jobs, offered roadside assistance, and turned my garage into a small enterprise. I bartered labor for parts and swapped hours for favors. Resourcefulness was no longer a virtue but a necessity. Friends stepped in where they could. Luis, a neighbor and steady hand, brought casseroles and watched the children on nights I drove extra runs. Mr. Jefferson, a client with a freight yard, admired my work ethic and offered counsel. "You fix things that matter, Parker. That matters." His words opened a door I had not noticed. By 1983, I filed for divorce. The decision was brittle relief, closure wrapped in paperwork. It did not erase loneliness but cut the pretzel of ambiguity that had wrapped our family. Legal separation clarified claims, protected the children, and set a course for rebuilding. Mr. Jefferson soon proposed I join his trucking firm in an operations role. He offered stability and a chance to turn road knowledge into management. It was an opportunity for reinvention, to support the family more reliably. Accepting meant becoming head of operations, not just the man who fixed trucks. I took the role. The job brought structure, allowed me to hire help, and eased daily pressure. Frank began to take responsibilities at the yard, learning engines in an industrial way. Aurora handled paperwork and learned to balance ledgers. Donald explored shipment logs and computers with a hungry curiosity. Their small contributions made the enterprise a family effort. Gossip softened when faces saw me steady and busy. Sideways pity turned into a rough respect. I kept dignity by focusing on the children and the business, shielding them from details that would harm their sense of normal. I told neighbors Maya had taken another job. Truth, I learned, can be calibrated to protect without abandoning the essence. Creditors came and county forms arrived. I faced letters I did not want to open and calls I had to answer with a steady voice. I sat with a social worker who asked blunt questions about childcare and income, and I learned to compress my answers into manageable sentences. Nights were for balancing invoices under lamplight. Mornings were for teaching Donald how to solder a circuit so he would be occupied while I worked on bids. Mr. Jefferson's mentorship went further than advice. He showed me payroll sheets, how to bid contracts, and introduced me to suppliers who would offer credit. We added small accessory sales at the depot and advertised repair services to neighboring farms. Frank joined repairs. Aurora built a simple ledger system that saved hours. Those changes kept trucks hauling and wages coming. I never saw remarriage as the quick fix. Instead, I resolved to build stability through work and to make truth and resilience the currency of our household. Gossip softened as neighbors began to see results rather than scandal. Betrayal had humbled me, but I refused to be defined by it. I would define what remained and what could grow from the ruins. By the end of 5 years, the garage had become a workshop. The children had skills that matched their ambitions. The life we had led felt like scaffolding for something stronger. Mr. Jefferson's faith and Luis's friendship were anchors. I had set out to protect and found a path to empowerment and modest success. The next surprise would test compassion and the resilience of two men whose lives had been twisted together by a woman's choices. The first time Thompson called after everything, his voice sounded like a man delivering a verdict. It was the summer of 1985. He told me his freight business had collapsed, that creditors had taken contracts, and that Sarah had nowhere steady to stay. He did not ask for pity. He asked for work. Those two words landed with weight. I had seen Thompson as a rival in shame and as a wounded man before, but a plea for work forces a decision that is both moral and practical. After Maya's disappearance, my life narrowed to duties. Long hauls, extra repairs, and rituals that kept the kids fed and safe. Anger toward Thompson and the memory of betrayal lived under my skin, but so did an obligation to our children and a stubborn belief in dignity. The choice to answer was less about forgiveness and more about protection. Of Sarah, the kids, and what remained of our home. When Thompson arrived in Atlanta, he looked smaller than I remembered. He carried a suitcase and a resignation that felt honest. Sarah had grown into a quiet teenager, her eyes mirroring Maya's. Mr. Jefferson agreed to put Thompson on in a clerical role at the freight yard. Filing manifests, calling customers, learning routines. It was modest work, but rhythm steadies men. I set rules from the start. He would work. He would not unsettle our family life. Thompson accepted with humility. Solidarity, I learned then, begins with small acts like showing up and keeping accounts straight. It does not erase hurt but creates space where wounds can be tended. At first, the air between us was taut. Work demanded cooperation, but it could not hide old wounds. I watched, not to spy but to guard the home. Frank came to the yard more often, grease-stained and eager. Aurora designed a filing system that saved hours. Donald wired a dispatch radio that cut wasted trips. The children's contributions knitted practical ties between home and yard. Thompson repaid us in steady labor and awkward efforts to be present without overstepping. He did not try to replace Maya. Instead, he learned how to pass a plate at dinner and help with small repairs. Repairing trucks and mending households are similar trades. Both require patience and humility. Forgiveness, I found, is mechanical. You loosen one rusted part and then another. Neighbors gossiped. Some called my decision charity. Others called it mercy. I called it necessity disguised as choice. Our family could not harden into bitterness without injuring the children. If offering work kept Sarah from drifting and taught our kids compassion, then the moral weight of my anger had to be balanced against practical needs. There were nights when old hurt rose, sharp and hot. I remembered Maya's words, "I love you both," as a rationalization that split loyalties and produced pain for many. Yet seeing Thompson stay late to finish manifests or watching him teach Sarah how to change a tire softened me. Those moments did not repair trust in a single sweep, but they made room for repair. The yard became a workshop for more than trucks. It was a place where trust was practiced in ordinary things. Punctuality, honest paper, returned tools. Frank and Sarah found a shared eye for mechanics. Aurora brought order to chaos, and Donald's tinkering kept radios clear. Small acts created a new daily dynamic where old wounds mattered but did not always dictate life. As months passed, I watched the arrangement settle into something resilient. Thompson learned office work and found rhythm. Sarah smiled without looking away. Neighbors shifted from suspicion to cautious respect as they saw us steady and productive. The moral of that season: reinvention is less a spectacular rebirth and more a daily routine of showing up and doing the right small things. Mr. Jefferson's quiet mentorship changed everything. He taught me to read bids, manage payroll, negotiate with suppliers, and think like an operator. Those lessons converted desperation into opportunity. I learned perseverance as craft. Pivoting routes, trimming margins, asking for credit, and treating customers with plain decency. The children absorbed every lesson. Frank's hands grew surer, Aurora's ledger shone. Donald began wiring dispatch systems with a seriousness that hinted at future innovation. We learned to turn pain into practical progress every day. When Thompson stepped off the bus that autumn, the air felt full of decisions I had already made and the ones I had yet to make. He walked with a small bag and a tired dignity. Sarah clutched a book and watched me as if cataloging everything. Thompson's freight had been sold in parts. His office emptied. His life had unraveled. I had invited them because a roof and steady work are sometimes more honest than speeches. Offering shelter felt like a practical act of compassion and a necessary move to protect the children. Fitting another adult into a home scarred by absence is messy. Small gestures mattered. Frank showed Sarah the engine bay and taught her how to hand tools safely. Aurora made a bed and arranged books. Donald wired a speaker so everyone could hear the radio from the kitchen. These practical acts, work, care, logistics, began to shape belonging. Thompson took a clerical job at the yard, filing manifests and calling clients. It was modest work, but it gave him rhythm. Rhythm steadies people. I set simple rules. Do the work, honor the household, avoid stirring old wounds. He accepted with humility. Solidarity, I found, starts small, showing up, honesty in accounts, punctuality. Neighbors watched and talked. Some labeled it charity. Others called it wisdom. Stigma against a single father lingered, but steady production quieted gossip. When our trucks ran on time and repairs held, People stopped demanding explanations. Respect grows out of performance, not excuses. Sarah needed more than provisions. She needed guidance. Frank became an informal mentor, patient and strict when necessary. Sarah learned to check oil, patch a coat, and count inventory. Aurora brought order to the office records, and Donald's tinkering kept dispatches clear. Their shared work built trust in practical ways. Thompson repaid effort with consistency. He did not try to assume roles reserved for a mother. Instead, he sat at the table, passed plates, and learned how to be useful. Repairing a household and repairing a truck demand similar traits: patience, the right tool, and the humility to keep showing up. Those small acts repeated softened the edges of old hurt. I remember nights of tension, times when a stray remark or an old photograph cut. Maya's words, "I love you both," still haunted me as explanation turned to betrayal for many. But watching Thompson stay late to finish manifests, or teach Sarah a practical skill, pride opened a place for repair. Forgiveness, I realized, is incremental. One honest task after another. Mr. Jefferson's approval helped. He trusted Thompson on modest accounts and delegated responsibilities to me, signaling faith in our competence. Managing men was different from fixing engines. It required patience, communication, and a willingness to see Thompson as colleague rather than only as reminder of the past. I learned to separate memory from present action. We established rituals. Sunday breakfasts to plan the week, a toolbox policy everyone respected, and an hour each evening where the children read aloud or worked on projects. Rituals are glue. They rehearse ordinary trust. Over months, the house shifted from a frame of absence to a place where new patterns could be taught and trusted. There were doubters. Some neighbors kept their distance. Old friends asked pointed questions. I answered with steady labor. Actions changed minds. Frank and Sarah found common ground, a shared eye for mechanics that turned into laughter. Aurora's ledgers reduced lost parts, and Donald's radio wiring cut wasted trips. Small wins accumulated. I did not mistake progress for cure. Sharp moments still came: a letter, a lawyer's question, the sudden memory of Maya's laugh. Those pains flared, but the daily work provided ballast. The yard became a workshop for rebuilding lives as well as trucks. Practical tasks anchored us in the present and taught resilience through repetition. Sometimes at night, watching Thompson handle manifests with quiet care, I wondered if this fragile trust might become a formal partnership, if shared labor and mutual respect could build a company that served our children better than the past. Truly. Once Thompson was on payroll, the yard became a classroom for practical virtues: punctuality, honesty, and an appetite for problem-solving. I watched him transform manifest sheets into tidy records and awkward apologies into reliable customer calls. He learned the cadence of schedules where once there had been only panic. The daily grind was not glamorous, but it revealed character. The children, too, stepped into new roles. Frank took on engine diagnostics with a seriousness that made me proud. Aurora drafted an inventory system that cut losses and turned margins from worry to steady numbers. Donald's tinkering matured into small innovations. He rewired dispatch radios to pick up frequencies that stopped a lot of wasted runs. Those contributions were not just practical. They were the currency of empowerment. One afternoon we faced a test that proved more consequential than any rumor. A major client was set to ship parts to a factory in Houston. A delay would cost us a contract and reputation. The truck scheduled for the route sprang a cylinder problem 2 hours before departure. The driver was beside himself. Panic is contagious in a yard. I remember a hush falling like the pause before a storm. Frank and Sarah worked in tandem. Frank diagnosed the issue, and Sarah retrieved the right part from the back of a stack I had assumed too high for her. With hands that had learned from watching and from doing, they got the engine running. Donald adjusted the radio so the dispatcher could reroute fuel stops. The truck left 2 hours late and arrived on time for the factory's receiving window. A small miracle credited to the teamwork we had cultivated. The client sent a note mentioning reliability and unexpected professionalism. For a community used to gossip, a note like that mended more than paper. It shifted conversations. The kindness of practical competence is a kind of redemption. In the office, Thompson's steady voice replaced a clattering nervousness. Clients who had once balked at his name began returning calls. He managed billing with care, corrected invoices, and learned to accept guidance without defiance. Those were small victories, but they mattered. Business trusts action over apology. Doing the job well is the fastest language of redemption. Not everything smoothed out. Old tensions surfaced in quiet ways. A late-night conversation about money could reopen an old wound. A mention of Maya's name would prick the air with a momentary frost. I learned to navigate these moments by focusing on structures. Clear jobs, fair pay, and a transparent ledger. Rules have a way of calming human tempers. Mr. Jefferson watched us build competence and began to suggest larger contracts. We started investing modestly, a second truck, a better set of tools, and a used computer for billing. Donald's project that made invoicing faster. Aurora began handling customer relations for smaller accounts, freeing me to focus on operations. Teamwork multiplied our capacity and yielded opportunity. All along, the children's sense of identity shifted. Frank no longer saw himself as merely a helper. He was an engineer in the making. Aurora's confidence in business matters grew into ambition. She began to dream of college and consulting gigs. Donald's curiosity about tech became a plan, not a hobby. And Sarah, who had once kept her gaze low, found a steady place beside Frank, learning to be counted rather than hidden. There were nights I lay awake counting bills and comparing dreams. Could we expand? Could we keep our family whole and also build something that lasted? The answer came in the small victories, like the Houston run and a growing list of satisfied customers. It was not a sudden yes. It was a patient accumulation of yes. Slowly, the yard's reputation shifted from one of dramatic gossip to quiet competence. The business started to feel less like a salvage operation and more like a company with potential. We were still tethered to our past, the betrayal that started it all, but tethering does not preclude motion. Being anchored to truth and hard work meant that the past could give context rather than dictate the future. In those months I learned that partnership is forged less by declarations than by reliability. Thompson's hands and my planning began to fit together like cogs. Where I managed operations, he handled administration. Where he brought humility, I provided strategy. The tentative seed of mutual respect grew roots in that soil. It would take a more devastating event to push us into formal partnership, but the foundation was laid in the work of everyday competence. When Mr. Jefferson told me his voice might not hold out much longer, the world tilted in a way that asked for action. He had been a quiet force in our lives, client, mentor, and a man whose freight yard had given me a second chance. The news of his illness arrived like a due date on a ledger, a deadline that required decisions. I would not use the phrase hero for Jefferson. He was practical and blunt. But his trust in me and his readiness to delegate mattered more than praise. He asked me to consider the future of the yard and whether I could keep operations steady if he stepped back. The question pushed me to think beyond day-to-day survival. We had grown modestly, a second truck, a better set of tools, cleaner ledgers, and a reputation that no longer centered on gossip. Thompson had proven reliable. The children were essential to operations. The yard hummed with competence. The opportunity to step up felt like a burden and an opening. One evening I sat at the kitchen table with Thompson, paper and tired eyes between us. We talked about roles like men who repair engines. Practical, detail-oriented, and impatient for results. I handled routing and operations. Thompson managed accounts and administration. We sketched the possibility of a new company that could take the yard's strengths and build on them. Great Height Logistics, a modest name with an aspirational sound. Founding a company is more than a signature. It is a pact with risk and an agreement to carry the burdens together. We divided responsibilities plainly. I would run operations, scheduling, hiring drivers, and fixing the fleet, while Thompson handled invoicing, payroll, and customer relations. That division matched our talents. Frank, Aurora, Donald, and Sarah would remain crucial. Apprentices and hands in the machine. Our children were not incidental. They were the future we aimed to protect. Mr. Jefferson, despite his illness, liked the plan. He offered us a transitional contract and mentorship as he slowly removed himself. The first months were a balancing act between gratitude and necessity. We paid vendors, negotiated small contracts, and learned the weight of responsibility. Mistakes happened. A misdelivery or a late invoice stung. Still, each correction taught resilience. Early success arrived in the form of steady customers who appreciated honesty and consistency. We took a few calculated risks. A local supermarket chain needed reliable overnight hauls, and we bid on routes that matched our capacity. The first extended contract covered costs and allowed us to improve the fleet. For the children, the work felt meaningful. We invested in people. Frank pursued mechanical certification, Aurora took business classes, Donald learned computing, and Sarah apprenticed in design. The company became a place where family ambitions could grow. Running a business required the temper of a patient man. There were nights when the ledger smoothed and mornings when the phone screamed. I found myself becoming less reactive and more strategic. Thompson's steady administration balanced my urgency. Partnership is less romance and more arithmetic. You add strengths and subtract weaknesses. Not everything was smooth. The 1989 economic downturn came as a test we had not expected so soon. Interest rates tightened and contracts shrank. Our modest expansion pushed us into uncomfortable margins. We scrambled. New accessory sales, direct repair services, and tighter credit terms with suppliers. Those months became lessons in perseverance. We leaned on community relationships and innovative small offerings that kept trucks moving and bills paid. Through these years, the vocabulary of our family changed. Words like resilience, reinvention, partnership, and empowerment shifted from speeches into functioning realities. Where betrayal once defined conversations, now competence and collaboration began to define us. Mr. Jefferson's gradual absence made the company ours, and that inheritance felt both precarious and sacred. By the time Jefferson's health failed completely, Great Height Logistics had found footing. We were not the largest, but we were reliable. The yard that once served as repair space had become a modest hub, supplying routes in and around Atlanta and neighboring states. We celebrated milestones quietly, a contract renewal letter, a repaired truck that kept a route alive, a local supplier's compliment. These felt like real rewards. Our work began to rewrite our family's future. By 1988 we had expanded routes around Atlanta, reached into neighboring states, and added drivers. Great Height Logistics felt less like a fragile hope and more like an enterprise finding its stride. The children took on roles that blurred family and business. Frank supervised repairs, Aurora handled client conversations and simple consulting, Donald began integrating small tech fixes, and Sarah designed our branding and flyers. The yard buzzed with activity, and for a time, the line between past and future felt less jagged. Then 1989 arrived with tighter credit and shifting demand. The economy squeezed small operators, suppliers raised terms, clients cut orders. One week a major client delayed payments and another renegotiated rates abruptly. Cash flow thinned like oil in winter. Panic is expensive. It eats small margins. We had to act fast or watch the gains disappear. We trimmed costs ruthlessly but thoughtfully. We introduced accessory sales at the depot, tires, belts, small parts that brought immediate cash. We offered on-site repairs to farms and small businesses that could not afford downtime. Donald's radio rewiring service, a project he had begun as a hobby, became a paid offer that saved routes from wasted time. These innovations were not glamorous, but they kept trucks moving and bills paid. Solidarity in the yard made the difference. When a driver was short on fuel, Frank offered to delay a small trip and combine loads. Aurora negotiated partial payments. Thompson wrote letters explaining temporary difficulties and won grace from some clients. It was laborious and humbling, but practicality becomes its own kind of courage. People respect those who solve problems rather than protest them. We also leaned on community relationships. Mr. Jefferson, though frail, made calls to suppliers he trusted and vouchsafed our diligence. A supplier offered extended credit on parts in return for timely payments when cash came. That vote of confidence kept engines rolling. We learned then what solidarity can yield when reciprocated. The strain tested relationships. There were nights when arguments flared over bills left unpaid, a shouted accusation, a slammed door. Resentment is human and it surfaces under pressure. I had to remind myself that resilience is not the absence of conflict but the will to resolve it. We held meetings, a family briefing on expenses, a frank talk about priorities, and an agreement to share small sacrifices. Those rituals kept us aligned. Marketing became a small obsession. Aurora redesigned flyers, Sarah redesigned the logo, and we targeted local businesses that needed reliable overnight hauls. Our honesty, promising only what we could deliver, began to resonate. Word of mouth, combined with a few bold bids, brought back enough work to stabilize certain routes. Slowly, the gap closed. By the end of the crisis, we were leaner and wiser. We had lost a small margin but preserved customer relationships and the crew's dignity. Those were not small victories. Economic shocks can strip a company bare, but they can also teach agility and humility. We learned to diversify revenue streams and to treat every customer as a potential partner rather than a simple transaction. That season shaped our company culture. We made policies that insisted on transparent invoices, fair payroll, and investment in basic training. We created a modest scholarship fund, more symbolic than generous, so that a promising young mechanic from town could learn the trade and return as an asset. The idea of giving back became part of our identity. Empowerment strengthened community ties, which in turn bolstered our business. Despite recovery, the scar remained. I watched Thompson grow quieter, his laugh less frequent. Health became a quiet worry. He brushed it aside, focusing on accounts, but I noticed the way he stood more slowly. A diagnosis would come later, but in those lean years, we only sensed a shadow. We did not know how deep the next test would be. Thompson's diagnosis would arrive later, and the lessons learned in 1989 would shape how we cared, together, deliberate and unafraid. I had never imagined running a business. For most of my life I fixed engines and drove long hauls, reading roads and gauges like scripture. When Mr. Jefferson's health declined, stewardship fell to me. We had a yard that worked, people who trusted us, and a chance to turn survival into something durable. Thompson and I sketched plans on a stained tabletop and chose a name that sounded like a promise. Great Height Logistics. Founding the company was less romance and more arithmetic. We divided roles with blunt honesty. I took operations, routing, hiring drivers, and maintaining the fleet. Thompson handled administration, invoicing, payroll, and client relations. Our children, Frank, Aurora, Donald, and Sarah, were apprentices whose contributions mattered. Frank supervised repairs, Aurora managed customer files, Donald integrated basic tech into dispatch, and Sarah developed our first branding. The first year was a study in grit. We negotiated contracts, sometimes losing bids and other times winning small routes that kept the wheels turning. My mornings began with checklists. My evenings ended with oil stain hands and ledger reviews under a single lamp. Perseverance became a daily habit. Each small success pushed back the old narrative of shame and fragility. We invested in practical improvements. A second-hand truck replaced rentals. A used computer sped invoicing. Simple training taught drivers to minimize breakdowns. I learned to read balance sheets as carefully as engine blueprints. Numbers became instruments of dignity rather than threats. The children's efforts multiplied our capacity. Frank's mechanical skill reduced downtime, Aurora's ledgers cut waste, Donald's tinkering improved communications. Business taught me about compassion in a practical register. Giving Thompson work had not erased betrayal, but granting him a stake made him accountable to more than memory. Solidarity became architecture. Clear roles, mutual expectations, and humility to admit mistakes. It was awkward and necessary to see two men transform grief into partnership. Challenges arrived as competition and cash flow. We got creative. Accessory sales at the depot, on-site repairs, and relationships with local farms. Those moves stabilized revenue and allowed modest expansion into neighboring states. Each route carried more than freight. It carried our reputation. Growth brought tension. Managing people required more than mechanical skill. I had to learn to lead. Not by dominating but by listening and enforcing fairness. Thompson's administrative steadiness complemented my urgency. When disputes arose, we mediated with transparent practices. Rules became scaffolding for trust. Our earliest triumphs were humble but meaningful. A supermarket chain awarded us a regular route after reliable deliveries. A supplier extended credit because we paid on time. These wins rewired perceptions. Neighbors who had whispered doubts began to call for service. We began to define the legacy we wanted. With each truck and payroll run, I thought of the children and what we wanted them to inherit. Not just assets but values. We set company policies prioritizing fair wages, reliable schedules, and apprenticeships. Aurora proposed a small scholarship for mechanics. Donald suggested a basic tech fund. Bit by bit, the business became an instrument for empowerment. Community mattered more than money. We sponsored a youth program and offered occasional reduced-cost repairs for neighbors. Those acts cultivated ties that supported us in hard seasons. Solidarity in practice proved mutual. Founding Great Height Logistics felt like the first decisive act of reinvention. From Betrayal's ashes we built a cooperative enterprise that honored work and accountability. Running a company taught me a new language for resilience. Combining grit with care. Success became not only earnings but the ability to sustain dignity through honest labor and to pass forward structures that improve lives. But the business was only part of the story. The human elements, Thompson's steady presence, the children growing into competence, and the quiet alliances formed at dusk, made triumph possible. Our company was not a monument to loss. It was a workshop to build what remained and choose a future the betrayal could not wholly define. We kept working, routing trucks, training apprentices, and making choices that stitched purpose into practice, and it shaped the future quietly. Growth brings confidence fast and complacency faster. By the late 1980s, Great Height Logistics had customers milling about. Our modest fleet ran routes into neighboring states, and our name began to be a word whispered in the right circles. Yet the decade also brought shifting markets and the kind of volatility that can bankrupt a man faster than any betrayal. We were lean and hungry enough to see opportunity, but the economy reminded us it would not tolerate sloppiness. The first real test came in a winter when repairs surged and a major client delayed payments. Cash flow is a thin blade. You only need a small cut to bleed. We tightened belts. Accessory sales at the depot, on-site repairs for farms, and negotiations with suppliers for delayed terms. Frank took on longer shifts in the shop. Aurora handled supplier calls with increasing confidence. Donald rewired radios to cut wasted dispatch time. Those innovations preserved margins and bought us breathing room. There were nights when the ledger looked like a puzzle with missing pieces. I remember sitting under a lamp balancing payments and promises, feeling the weight of each signature I had signed. Running a family business collapses private worry into public risk. Every missed invoice felt like a personal failure, but I learned to view errors as teachers. Perseverance in those years was practical. Find a patch, test it, and move on. Community support mattered. Neighbors told stories of small favors. Luis lending a generator during a freeze, a supplier extending a short credit line because Mr. Jefferson vouched for us. Those moments of solidarity were not charity. They were banking on our integrity. Reciprocity mattered. When we could, we returned help. Fixing a neighbor's pickup at cost or offering a reduced delivery for a community event. That kind of mutual aid strengthened the social fabric that sustained our business. We also diversified. Aurora proposed a customer loyalty program that bundled minor maintenance with regular deliveries. Donald developed a simple log system that tracked mileage and parts, reducing unnecessary replacements. Frank's mechanical savvy kept repair times low. These small shifts improved profitability and taught the children that reinvention is often incremental, not dramatic. The harder moments tested relationships. A delayed payment sparked an argument between Thompson and me about credit decisions. He worried about liquidity. I worried about reputation. We hashed out principles. No reckless bids, transparent ledgers, and a commitment to pay workers fairly. Negotiation became the engine of trust in our company. Those conversations were not comfortable, but they were essential. When the 1989 downturn arrived, it came with pressure on routes and interest rates that tightened credit. We took hits. Contracts renegotiated, margins reduced. Survival required creativity. We began selling accessories at the yard, offered emergency towing to local farms, and promoted on-site diagnostics that reduced downtime and kept cash moving. Innovation rarely arrives as a flash of genius. It shows up as necessity executed well. The children's roles deepened into leadership. Frank began training junior mechanics and took a certification course. Aurora enrolled in night classes to improve accounting skills. Donald started designing a basic dispatch computer system from salvaged parts. Sarah moved into brand design, improving our flyers and building small promotional campaigns. Their work was not merely labor. It was the inheritance of agency. Empowerment, in practice, looks like an apprenticeship turning into authority. We lost some contracts and tightened margins, but the crisis also clarified priorities. We focused on routes that matched our capacity, invested in maintenance to avoid breakdowns, and strengthened relationships with reliable customers. Those decisions required discipline and the humility to say no to growth that could collapse us. Resilience is sometimes the art of subtraction. By the end of the decade, Great Height Logistics was leaner and more agile. We had fewer frills but stronger processes. Our employees had been trained to anticipate problems and fix them before complaints formed. The yard's reputation shifted. Clients respected our reliability and the personal attention we gave small accounts. The company had weathered storms and learned to speak the language of perseverance. Still, the decade closed with a shadow. Thompson's health would soon test not just our finances but the depth of our solidarity, and what we did next would define us further. In 1994, Thompson sat me down and said plainly, "They say I have cancer." Those words rearranged priorities. Bills remained and routes needed drivers, but illness demanded care beyond contracts. Thompson wanted plans, not pity. We organized schedules so he could work without overreaching. I learned compassion as logistics. Arranging rides, keeping ledgers current, and making room in routines. Medical care was costly and complicated. We timed surgeries between contracts, negotiated treatments, and arranged transport. Frank, Aurora, and Donald took extra shifts. Sarah prepared meals and tried to keep the house light. These small acts were daily labor that steadied us. Watching Thompson, a man previously tied in my mind to betrayal, receive care with gratitude reshaped how I saw him. Our relationship evolved into brotherhood, not because betrayal vanished but because need redefined priorities. The months that followed became a curriculum in practical care. I learned to schedule routes around chemotherapy and to read medical instructions with the same care I once read engine manuals. Thompson, once proud and bristly, began to speak differently. Grateful for kindness and careful with requests. He attended meetings when he could and listened as Frank suggested refurbishments. Presence mattered. Our staff adjusted. We formalized backup plans for drivers, introduced modest sick pay for short absences, and documented procedures so operations would not stall if someone was suddenly unavailable. These changes were functional and cultural. The company would protect its people as it protected contracts. Meeting language shifted. We spoke of resilience and compassion as metrics alongside margins. Solidarity returned in concrete ways. Mr. Jefferson, weakened by his own illness, offered counsel from a distance. Neighbors brought casseroles. A supplier extended credit without immediate demands. These were pragmatic lifelines that kept trucks on the road and gave Thompson space to focus on healing. Practical compassion was the currency that kept the yard moving. There were hard nights when prognosis worsened and patience frayed. Men in waiting rooms bare grief quietly. Still, moments of tenderness appeared. Thompson's weak laughter, Aurora coaxing a smile, Frank promising to rebuild an engine stronger. Those sparks kept us steady. When Thompson's health declined sharply in 1997, we prepared. Wills arranged, payroll smoothed, and a plan for Sarah that honored his wishes. The day he died, the yard felt quieter, like engines mourning. We held a small service. Neighbors who once gossiped came to show support. Community solidarity reminded me that dignity attracts loyalty. Grief hollowed us, but commitments followed. I invited Sarah to live with us, honoring Thompson's memory and promising to raise her alongside my children. Sarah entered our household cautious and guarded. She took small tasks at first, filing, helping with flyers, and found agency in design work. Over time, she assumed greater responsibilities in branding and small marketing efforts. The children, bonded by shared hardship, welcomed her as kin rather than outsider. Business continued, but with a steadier ethic. We shifted from ad hoc care to clear policies, sick leave, training stipends, and a modest scholarship for apprentices. These measures honored a principle. Empowerment should be embedded in operations. Value is not merely profit. It is pathways for others to rise. Grief reshaped us into an unconventional family that functioned with dignity. The lessons of betrayal became context rather than verdict. We chose to be defined by rebuilding and by whom we protected. Brotherhood born from pain taught me that the best response to betrayal is building systems that reduce harm and increase opportunity. After Thompson's passing, I balanced grief with administration. We met a lawyer and clarified succession to prevent disputes, freeing the family to grieve without legal chaos. We memorialized Thompson through modest structures, a scholarship for apprentice mechanics, a policy for paid sick days, and a small plaque at the yard. In the years after, the company adopted a mission to elevate people through work. We formalized apprenticeships that paired experienced mechanics with local youths who otherwise lacked access. I taught a boy to change a gasket and saw fear turn to pride. Empowerment proved to be skill plus opportunity plus dignity. The yard shifted in reputation. People came for steady work and stayed for the training. I learned about forgiveness. It did not require forgetting. It demanded a choice about response. We chose to build systems that reduced harm and increased opportunity. That choice reshaped our family and ensured Thompson's memory lived in policies and practices that protected others. When Thompson died, the house felt like a machine missing a critical gear. His absence was both a silence and a demand. The promise to care for Sarah and to keep the company stable. We honored that promise by inviting Sarah into our home and into the rhythms of our family. She arrived guarded, clutching an old photograph, but gradually the place rearranged itself to make room for her. Frank taught her to check oil. Aurora tutored her in ledgers. Donald showed her how a simple design could change a flyer's impact. Raising Sarah alongside my children required sensitivity and patience. She had lived with a different history, and our household had scars that needed tending. We did not pretend the past was clean. Rather, we offered routines, skills, and steady expectations. Homework time, shop rotations, and evening meals regained their rhythm and, with them, dignity. The children learned to be siblings by performing practical tasks, sharing tools, rotating chores, and collaborating on a delivery schedule. That practical rhythm taught more than words could. As Sarah settled, the company moved from survival mode into growth. Frank pursued mechanical certification and brought in new efficiencies. Aurora studied business and refined invoicing systems. Donald's tinkering matured into integrating a basic dispatch computer. Sarah's design sense improved our public materials and client proposals. In 2003, we marked a quiet milestone. 25 years of making decisions that kept trucks moving and families fed. We celebrated with a modest yard party and a small program of scholarships. Business success did not erase the past, but it redirected our energy toward community impact. We hired locally, paid fair wages, and funded scholarships that created pathways for youth in trade skills. Partnering with local schools, we offered internships and mentorship, teaching both technical skills and workplace ethics. Empowerment took the shape of opportunity and apprenticeship. That practical aim anchored the company as a community institution. As the company expanded into modest international partnerships by 2008, we kept local commitments in place. Our growth strategy prioritized stable routes and repeat clients. We added services such as on-site diagnostics and accessory sales, which provided additional revenue streams and increased customer loyalty. Growth brought administrative complexity, but it also allowed us to institutionalize our care policies. Sick leave, training stipends, and an emergency fund for employees facing hardship. Personal life took on a different tenor. I never remarried. My marriage had been a source of happiness and deep pain. Staying single felt like a deliberate choice to honor the children and the work we had built. My days were structured around the yard and the family. I gave talks at local gatherings about resilience and dignity, lessons born from betrayal and rebuilt through responsibility. The community began to ask me to speak about entrepreneurship and stewardship. The yard's reputation shifted over time. Where gossip once hung heavy, respect replaced idle talk. Neighbors began to rely on our services and to recommend us. Word of mouth and consistent performance were the marketing that money could not buy. We became known for reliable overnight hauls and honest billing, and our modest scholarship program produced technicians who returned as employees. Loss had taught me certain truths. Resilience is practiced through repetition. Dignity is negotiated in daily choices, and family can be rebuilt on different terms. The company's successes became more meaningful when they delivered for more than our household. Each new hire who learned a trade was a small victory against the precariousness that had once threatened us. By 2017, I was invited to speak at conferences for small business owners. I talked about practical policies, apprenticeships, sick leave, community partnerships, and about the moral architecture that supports a durable company. People asked about forgiveness, and I said plainly, forgiveness is a decision to act differently, to build structures that prevent future harm. In late 2019, we merged with a regional firm to expand routes and provide new opportunities for our staff. The merger was strategic and careful. We retained our policies and extended training programs. It felt like the natural next step for a company that had begun as a repair yard and then learned to hold people as well as goods. Through it all, the household expanded to include grandchildren. Watching them play in the yard, small hands reaching for tools under supervision, felt like a gentle payoff. The past never left us, but it was woven into a future where dignity and opportunity became the inheritance we valued most. My legacy became less about wealth and more about teaching others how to rebuild with courage, compassion, and practical ingenuity, across generations too. I wake before dawn now, the house softened by years and the hum of a business that no longer needs my hands in every bolt. The yard still stands under the sign Great Height Logistics. What began as hope became a means of sustenance for many. When I think of the journey, from a misplaced greeting card to a family enterprise that trains young people, I am struck by how betrayal can become a vector for reinvention. Maya's story ended quietly. She died in the 1990s from complications of diabetes. Her passing brought no triumphalism, only a complicated relief that allowed memory without rage. Forgiveness for me was not absolution. It was choosing a path forward. I often say, life doesn't end with betrayal. It begins when you decide what to do with it, and those words seem truer each year. The company passed into our children's hands with care. Frank continued as head of operations. Aurora led client relations and consulting. Donald integrated modern dispatch systems and expanded routes nationally. Sarah became creative director, shaping branding with dignity. Together they kept the company's commitments, sick leave, apprenticeships, and training funds, intact while growing reach responsibly. We expanded into regional partnerships and merged with a firm in 2019 to secure jobs and improve coverage. The merger was careful. We retained our policies and extended training programs. Growth brought administrative complexity, but it allowed us to institutionalize care policies and provide stable careers for many. The yard's modest scholarship fund and apprenticeship pipeline sent graduates into steady work. These were deliberate investments in community stability. Public speaking became part of later life. In 2017, I addressed entrepreneurs about humility, persistence, and the dignity of small work. I spoke about how sick leave and training are not mere costs but foundations for longevity. Those talks were not about ego but sharing practical lessons that saved us from repeating old mistakes. Family life offered soft rewards. I never remarried. Staying single felt right to honor the children and the work we built. I watched 7 grandchildren learn to hold tools under supervision. Their laughter a balm I did not know I needed. The house remains dedicated to our family's rhythms. Mornings incline toward work and evenings toward storytelling. Legacy is less a monument than a daily practice. Policies that pay workers on time, apprenticeships that teach tradecraft, and small scholarships that open doors. If the children ask what I did, I tell them, I fixed what I could, taught what I knew, and tried to protect those around me. It is a humble answer, but it contains the bones of what matters: resilience, dignity, and solidarity. People ask if I regret not confronting Maya earlier or if anger ever consumed me. Regret exists. Naivety shaped choices. But every decision, whether to confront, to shelter the children, or to build a company, carried consequences. I framed those consequences as lessons that shaped the way I treat others. The core message I leave is simple. Betrayal can break you or make you. Courage is not roar but repetition. Teaching an apprentice, paying a sick worker, giving a scholarship. Build systems that protect others. Teach skills that empower them. When life fractures you, use the pieces to build a structure that serves more than yourself. In the years after the merger, we balanced scale with care. Our footprint extended into neighboring states and small international routes, but governance stayed local. Each new contract required review for fair pay and training opportunities. We established a fund for employees facing medical emergencies and formalized a mentorship program matching apprentices with seasoned technicians over 2 years. I remember Marcus, a mentee who arrived unsure and left confident, trained, employed, and proud. The public talks deepened our influence. On stage, I told audiences about practical reinvention. How to convert personal pain into organizational practices that protect people. I described policies we adopted, emergency pay, documented training paths, and partnerships with local schools. People nodded, took notes, and some called afterward to change how they ran payroll. Those ripples felt like a kind of justice. As the years stacked, I measured success differently. Balance sheets mattered, but so did apprentices trained, scholarships awarded, and households stabilized by steady wages. Those small, human figures became my quiet pride and the legacy I hoped our family would steward for generations. I told my children metrics include kindness, training hours, and lives lifted by steady, honest work over long seasons. I walk to the gate as drivers prepare routes, breathe the morning, and think of the young man I once was, trusting, naive, and proud. Time has taught me humility. The greatest work of my life was not counting trucks but creating a framework where dignity, care, and opportunity could travel together. Before you go, I need you to be honest with me, and with yourself. If you discovered the anniversary card I found, would you confront the person you love, or would you protect the children and bury the truth? When betrayal cuts the life you built, is survival found in revenge, in walking away, or in reinventing everything you thought you knew about family and duty? Tell me, where do you draw the line between trust and naivety? If someone you loved used your money to build another life, is that financial abuse or a secret you should try to understand? Would you choose solidarity with the betrayed, or mercy for the betrayer? Could you forgive and build a business with the man who shared your wife, or would dignity demand you burn every bridge? I want to know which scares you more. The shame of exposing deceit or the shame of letting it fester? Which matters more, protecting your children's innocence, or teaching them the hard truth about accountability and courage? If you were in my shoes, would you turn pain into purpose, or let bitterness define your legacy? Drop your answer in the comments. Be raw, be real. Where are you watching this from, and which choice would you make? Share your take on resilience, empowerment, forgiveness, and legacy. If this story gripped you, subscribe for more true-to-life revenge and reinvention stories. Your perspective matters. Tell me now.